Arizona territory, late summer. A sky like hammered tin. Wind shears grit across a bone-white arroyo, where a broken wagon lists like a wounded animal. Vultures circle low. Heat mirages boil off the basin. Thunder crawls over distant buttes without rain. Etta Vale, a young settler widow who took a vow of silence after her husband's death, is stranded at a way station with one canteen, a failing mare, and the deed to a small spring the cattlemen want. 3 riders crest the ridge. Ruffians tied to her husband's last night alive. She has nowhere to run, and no voice to bargain with, only the quiet things she learned years ago from a Chiricahua Apache woman who taught her the blade. She steps back into the station's doorway, but the rider who dismounts at dusk is no savior. He's wearing her dead husband's boots, and he knows her by a name she buried. This account survives in a sheriff's deposition where one witness's name was scratched out, an undertaker's ledger, billing 6 pine boxes to unknowns, and a coroner's inquest that lists a knife wound from the wrong hand. Next, you'll see why that single scratch, those 6 boxes, and that wrong hand wound changed everything. The sky looked hammered flat above the Arizona basin, a metal lid pressed down on heat and dust. Wind slid through the bone-white arroyo and lifted grit like a veil, then flung it hard against a broken wagon that listed on a split axle, the way a wounded animal leans when it cannot stand. Vultures moved slow circles over the wash. Mirages shook and boiled over the salt crust, as if water lived just under the skin of the earth and refused to come up. Thunder dragged its nails along distant buttes, but gave no rain. The way station squatted in that glare, with its door unlatched and its windows shuttered from the afternoon blaze. A small brown shape that had decided not to ask the sky for permission anymore. Etta Vale stood in the doorway, with a strip of rawhide between her fingers. She pulled it tight across a new latch she had cut from a cedar rail. She did not speak. She had not spoken for months, not since the dirt closed over her husband. Silence had become her belt and her habit. When she tied the latch and tested it, the leather creaked and held. Her mare stood in the shade of the station wall with her head low and breath hot. One canteen hung from a nail just inside the door. Etta lifted it, weighed it, and set it back without drinking. Her eyes were the only moving part of her. Inside, Agnes Dunn added lines to a ledger with neat wrists and firm, careful pen strokes. She had the face of a woman who had learned numbers from grief. Her father had been the undertaker. She had buried him by noon and boiled his tools by evening and kept his books ever since, though now she ran the station for travelers and kept the undertaker's ledger rolled under oilcloth on a shelf. The shelf held packets tied in ribbon and toe tags that had never found their proper names. She listened to the wind and to Etta's quiet working. She did not ask the widow if she would eat. Etta ate when the sun lost its edge. 3 riders pushed up out of the heat shimmer and stood black against the ridge, the horses blown and the men big in their coats. They watched the station from that slight height. One lifted an arm and set it on his hip. Leather flashed. Etta saw the posture and felt her belly turn cold and small. She stepped back, not because she was afraid of the men themselves, but because of the length between the station door and the dry wash. Open ground always favors the one who points a gun. Closed ground favors the hand that can reach first without seeming to move at all. She looked at the floor, at the knothole near the lintel where she had slipped a thin knife, at the shadow behind the wood stove that hid a second blade, at the floorboard she had loosened to hold one more length of edge for a moment like this. They came down the slope with a kind of lazy patience that meant they thought the place already theirs. The one in front wore a pale hat with a narrow band and a dust coat that hung open to show a vest with a bright button that did not belong to this county. His horse moved as if it knew how to read a man's temper and wanted to stay ahead of it. When he reached the track, he turned his head and spat, then smiled like a boy finding a stray dime. Etta could see his boots now. They were familiar. The leather shone where spurs had rubbed it, and the toe had a scuff she had once rubbed with tallow on a night before a dance. She felt the floor come up a little and steady her feet. She breathed once through her nose, and was glad her mouth was closed. Harlan Pike swung off the horse and let the reins fall. He touched the brim of his hat to Agnes, as if to say he had learned manners once, and let his eyes slide across Etta like a blade laid against skin to feel the beat. "Afternoon," he said. "I've come to set a thing right." Agnes's pen did not stop moving. "What thing needs setting, Mr. Pike?" "The matter of water." He put his boot on the step. "That spring up in the fold behind your station? It's ours by cents, if not by paper. We'll pay too, if it makes your conscience sleep. But we will have it." Agnes closed the ledger and laid the pen atop it like a small rifle with the safety on. "I run a station. I sell coffee and stew and shade. I do not sell springs." Pike looked past her to Etta and smiled again, the way a cat smiles at a bird that thinks its branch is stout. "You don't. But there's a widow in this house who holds a deed she doesn't know how to carry. The paper sits heavy on a woman's hands. I'll hold it for her. I'll soften the weight." Etta's silence sat between them like another person in the room. She made no gesture that might be taken for speech. She lifted her chin just enough to see the edges of Pike's boots again. They were her husband's. The scar on the left toe was a kiss from a rock on the San Pedro Trail. A day when Etta had laughed so hard she had to sit down in the dust. She had rubbed that scuff with tallow while he leaned in the doorway and pretended not to know how proud she was of him. Now a stranger stood inside her memory like a thief on her porch. Bram Kincaid rode in last and did not dismount. His badge caught a slice of sun on a brass ring at his breast, then winked away. He held a folded notice in 2 fingers, the way a man holds a fly by one wing. He looked like a boy wearing his father's hat after the funeral. Fear made his grin tight. "We're here in the name of the county," he said, though his eyes slid to Pike after the words left him. "Law needs the spring kept in common." Agnes looked at the badge, then at the bright button on Pike's vest, then at the boots. "Common," she said. "That word belongs to people who fetch water with the same tin cup." Pike put one hand on the doorframe and leaned in. The room darkened under his shadow. "Let's be plain. I'll pay you in coin for the deed, and I'll let your widow keep her mare and her canteen, or I'll take the paper after sundown and pay no one. Up to you." He lifted the toe of one boot and scuffed the threshold with a small grind, as if the wood belonged to his heel by nature. Etta felt the knife in the lintel, the way a thirsty tongue feels a tooth. She put her fingertips to the edge of the table and breathed slow and let her mind uncurl toward another place and another hand. Kaya had stood behind her once with a split willow switch and had set Etta's wrist in line with her forearm. "Do not stiffen," Kaya had said. "A knife does not move against a man's guard the way a club does. The blade is the river. The man is the rock. The river does not fight the rock. It finds the line around it and never stops and never hurries and always arrives where it wants to arrive. A breath goes in. The wrist turns. The arm is just a path. The hand is only the water's last word." Agnes slid something across the table without looking down. It was small and cold and made a thin sound against the wood. A key. Etta closed her hand over it. The key belonged to the cupboard where Agnes kept the bone whistle and the lamp oil. Agnes's thumb brushed the ledger's corner. Etta understood. She nodded once. So faint, the nod lived more in her heartbeat than in her neck. Pike lifted his chin. "No answer from our silent lady? She doesn't speak since the funeral? I like a quiet house. Makes a man feel like he's master there." Kincaid unfolded his paper. "I have other business. The county asks me to post this notice before the end of day." He rode the horse 2 steps closer and put the paper up on the door with 2 tacks from a small tin. The notice shivered when the wind touched it and then held. Etta read the words with the cold patience of a surveyor. Warrant, Etta Vale. Suspicion of murder. A smaller line lived under the big ones, printed in a thinner hand. The victim named was her husband. Pike did not let his smile move, but his eyes were happy. "You see, the law has questions about that poor man's death. They had them last winter. They have them now. Who made the hole under his ribs? Who touched the handle? Who stood behind him? Who ran away? The county wants answers. Let us help you make your answers simple." Agnes stood and faced the door, so no man could say later that the station keeper had hidden her face. "You post what you like," she said to Kincaid, "but remember I write my own lines as well. I have a ledger. I can put a man's name in black or in red, and I prefer black." Kincaid's tongue touched his lip and left it wet. "It's the law, Miss Dunn. It's only the law. The law is a man's hand until he proves it's a book," Agnes said. Etta put her hand on the latch she had just tied and felt the leather press back into her palm. She took the key into her other hand. She did not look at the knife in the lintel, because looking is the same as reaching when a man understands hands. She looked at Pike's boots again, and then at the doorframe, and then she let her gaze drift to the floorboard by the stove that she had lifted once and set back. She marked exactly where his weight would fall if he came one more step inside. She let her breath go slow and long and quiet. This was the river. The rock did not know it was already wet. The men pulled back into the heat, and Kincaid lifted his notice and patted it like a dog. "We'll camp in sight," Pike said. "We'll keep your station safe from Comancheros and raiders and lawbreakers. We'll drink from the spring to keep our throats clean for the watching." He tipped his hat and walked to his horse. When he planted his boot in the stirrup, Etta saw the scuff again. She looked away as a woman looks away from a grave, so her face will not teach the grass how to weep. As the light flattened and yellowed, vultures slid lower, interested now, not in Mythwater, but in the way men think about other men. Inside, Agnes lifted the ledger again and wrote something Etta could not see. Her hand shook once. She steadied it and finished the line. She rolled the book and tied it with string and set it back on the shelf like a sleeping child. When the sun reached the ridge, Brother Matthew rode in from the east with dust on his collar and a worry line between his eyes. He moved like a man torn between two altars. He swung down and took his hat in his hands and bowed because that was his habit before any door. "Miss Dunn," he said. "Mrs. Vale. I saw the notice from the road." His voice went thin. "Is it true?" Agnes did not answer him. She poured coffee that had sat too long and would taste like anger, and poured it anyway. He took the cup. His hands were too clean for this county. He had ink under his nails from writing names no one else would write. He always looked like a man who had just washed after touching something that would not come off. He tried to speak to Etta, and then remembered her vow. He turned his face to Agnes. "There is a thing I did," he said. "I may have done it wrong. I wrote a name in the parish book. Harlan Pike asked me to. He said the county needed the record kept for order. It was a burial. He said it was Mr. Vale. He said it had to be written that day. It was the wrong hour. It was after dark. I did it anyway. The ink smeared. I told myself the smear did not matter." He swallowed and closed his eyes and opened them. "I am not sure who I buried in the book." Agnes set his cup back in his hand so he would stop wringing it empty. "You wrote what a man told you when the hour was wrong and the candles low." She lifted his hand a little with the cup in it and pointed it toward his mouth. "Now drink like a man and hold the cup steady." Etta took the key to the cupboard and fit it to the lock. She turned it soft. The cupboard door opened without a squeak because she had filed the hinge a little each evening the past week with a nail and oil. She removed a small bone whistle from a tin. She placed it under her tongue and closed her mouth and felt the smooth curve. Kaya had given it to her on a day when the river ran thick with spring melt. Etta could not make a loud sound with it, only a pattern, a thin, high line that pulled through the night like a thread. No one could see unless they had been shown where it lived. Agnes saw the whistle and looked at the door, and then at Etta, and then down at the ledger, and Etta was glad the station keeper knew when to keep her eyes on sums. By full dark, the men had lit their camp across the wash. Their fire licked low inside a ring of stones. One man sang a rough line under his breath about a girl in Abilene and a bedroll. Pike cleaned his nails with a knife and held a boot out to the flames to drive a pebble from the welt. Kincaid took the notice from the door and read it again, as if the words might improve on second thinking. He folded and unfolded the paper until the crease looked like a scar. He put it back up. He needed the paper to speak for him. It could not whisper when it was folded like that. Etta and Agnes blacked the station windows with the spare quilt and a piece of canvas cut from the halted wagon. They put damp cloth at the sill, so no light would creep out. Brother Matthew knelt by the corner and did something with his lips that was either prayer or pain. The mare shifted and blew a wet snort, then went quiet with the sweet patience horses use when they have decided to help you outlive your luck. Etta took the bone whistle and walked to the back wall, where the worst of the wind didn't push. She placed her hand on the wood and put her ear to it and listened to the station's brittle breath. Then she blew one soft call through the whistle, and then another, and then a third, with pauses between, the way Kaya had taught her. Not a song, a pattern. If you have not heard it, it is nothing. If you have, it finds you even with your eyes closed. Agnes lifted the lamp and set it near the stove, then covered half the chimney with her palm to drop the light without killing it. She sprinkled a thin line of flour across the floor where the door would open, and a second line behind the stove, and set a strip of window glass under the latch so that when the latch dropped, it would tap the glass and sing a little note that the men outside would not hear. Brother Matthew watched, with his mouth open, as if a lesson was walking across the floor to stand on his boots and beg him to pay attention. Kincaid came to the door before midnight. He tapped the notice with his finger like a bishop tapping a Bible, to remind himself it carried the weight he felt slipping from his shoulders. "Come out and speak to me," he said, "not loud enough to be brave and not quiet enough to be kind. I will hear you as a friend." He did not believe his own words. They slid out and fell between his boots. Agnes answered from 2 steps back, where the dark made her taller. "This house sleeps. Come in daylight. I have daylight on my side," he said, and then winced at how that sounded in the dark. "Then you can wait until it comes back," she said. He shifted and the saddle leather creaked under his hand. "The coroner's inquest said the knife went in from the right," he blurted, as if the words would form a shield if he got them all out fast. "Your widow is left-handed. That's what I heard." He waited for the silence to change shape. It did not. He licked his lip. "We have to ask questions, that's all." He stepped back and tripped a little on a low stone. He turned and went, and his shadow slid away. Etta stood with her back to the wall and let her eyes go soft until the dark lost its edges. She remembered Kaya holding her wrist above the red water, telling her the arm is not a weapon. The mind is both the sheath and the strike. She flexed her fingers and loosened them. The room held its breath with her. She thought of the bone whistle's pattern, floating out across the draw and up the bit of slope toward the place where the old river cut the ridge thin and left a lip you could stand on and look down without being seen. She thought of a figure on that lip. She closed her eyes and opened them once, gentle, like a hand on a door that knows the lock will open because it has opened before. At the second hour past midnight, Jonah Vale slid through the stable door with a shoulder scrape and a small curse he swallowed. He looked like a man whose coat was full of broken glass. He smelled like fear, gone sour in old wool. Etta saw her husband's jaw on him and the way his hair didn't lie flat when the air got wet. He set his hands out like a supplicant in a painting and kept them where she could see them because he had sense enough to know a woman in a dark room needs to see hands first. "I came to ask pardon," he said to Agnes, because he could not say it to Etta, "and to give warning. I told Harlan Pike about the spring. I thought he would pay and leave it be. I did not know he would." He broke off. "He said he sold the boots at an auction. That was a lie. He keeps them because he likes a story under his feet. He keeps the signet too." He pulled a cloth from his pocket and set it on the table. It held a smear of red wax on a torn corner of a form. "I took this from the coroner's office. I should not have. I wanted the truth in my hand. It burns. Please take it from me." Brother Matthew leaned forward and peered at the wax. His throat moved. "That mark," he whispered. "That is the coroner's seal. And the edge, someone pressed a ring into it. A ring like a badge, but different." He lifted his eyes to the ceiling as if an answer might hang there among the cobwebs. "God forgive me," he said, not loud enough to matter yet. Etta touched Jonah's sleeve, not to comfort him, but to direct him. She pushed him behind the stove where the flour line would tell her if he tried to get clever with fright. He went because he remembered the way she had looked the day they stood over his brother's grave and said nothing while the shovel went in and out, like a slow machine that built a wall between them, one small brick at a time. He understood that a woman's silence can be a bridge or a blade, and he hoped to land on the bridge. The wind swung around near dawn. It came cool from the rocks for a brief hour, as if some tight hand had turned the basin a notch and let night's shadow slip down into the wash. Agnes let the mare drink 2 mouthfuls. She wiped the animal's throat with wet cloth and gave the water back to the bucket to save the taste. Etta moved around the room and checked each small thing that would matter if men came fast and loud. The line of glass under the latch, the dusting of flour, the place where the floorboard lifted with the gentlest tug. She took the knife from the lintel and slid it into the hem of her skirt, then took the second blade and fit it to the small of her back where her spine was a straight ruler that knew how to teach a line, the difference between error and correctness. By full morning, the heat rose again and made everything brittle. The men outside sat in their shadows and did not talk. Pike chewed a stem and watched the door the way a man watches a card that he knows he can cut into his own favor. Kincaid walked a small circle and kept touching the paper on the door with a fingertip, as if the paper could feel his need. The third man slept with his hat over his face and his hand on his belt so that he could wake mean. The day crawled. Twice Agnes made food, and no one ate. Once Brother Matthew fell asleep in a chair and woke with a start and said a name he did not mean to say out loud. Etta wrote a note on a scrap of paper and slid it toward him. He read it and looked at her with tears in his eyes. The note said, "You can correct a book." He nodded. He put his hand on his chest as if to hold the promise there until he could get it into the world. At dusk, Pike stood and rolled his shoulders. He had a man's patience for his own wants, which is to say he could wait until his waiting hurt him, and then he had to move. He walked partway to the door and stopped, and smiled, and turned aside as if he had just decided to be generous and go back to his fire. Then he swung fast and reached as if to lift the latch and step through. The glass under the latch chimed a small note. The note ran across the floor like a string, pulled tight and plucked once by a nervous child. Etta saw his weight go to his right side. She saw his hand slide to the knife that cleaned his nails. She moved her left shoulder an inch. The river found its first bend. He did not step in. The deputy called from the ridge. "Hold," Kincaid said, his voice high and edged. "There's a rider." Pike turned his head. "Whose silhouette is that?" he asked, like a man at a play who already knows the next line but wants to hear it anyway. Etta took a small shard of mirror from the shelf and held it in the low lamplight at an angle, the way she had practiced, so it would catch the ridge without showing her own face to the men outside. The mirror took the last of the dusk and dragged it into the room and laid it down on the table, and in that thin light she saw a figure on the lip where the old river had cut the rock. The figure stood with feet apart and knees soft. The wind tugged hair that had been tied only once that morning and then left to do as it pleased. The right hand was low. The left hand, the old scarred one, lifted and made a small circle in the air, the way you might circle a word in a book to make a student feel the right heat. The circle said, "I heard you." Etta felt her throat close around the smallest breath she had taken since she chose not to take any more. The bone whistle lay warm against her tongue. She shut her eyes for one heartbeat and saw a red river and a willow switch and a woman's hand correcting a girl's stubborn wrist. She opened her eyes and let the room come back. She looked down at the floor. The flour had not been smudged by any foot, but there, the latch glass lay ready. The door stood between two kinds of night. On the ridge, Kaya Nantan made another small sign. It looked like nothing to most eyes. It looked like a woman brushing a fly from the air. To Etta it said, "River stance, not stone." This account survives in a sheriff's deposition where one witness's name was scratched out, an undertaker's ledger billing 6 pine boxes to unknowns, and a coroner's inquest that lists a knife wound from the wrong hand. The scratch, the 6, and the wrong hand line will tell you what the men outside did not know yet. that the river had already chosen its path around their rock. Pike squinted up at the ridge and laughed, a small, ugly sound that had no humor in it. "You bringing friends, widow?" he called. "Seems like you found one who doesn't mind the view." He turned his head to smile at Kincaid, to measure the deputy's fear for weight and texture. Kincaid did not laugh. He stared at the ridge and pulled his badge chain once, as if to make sure it was still attached to the only thing that gave his chest weight. Etta slid her hand along the table and felt the small tremor there, not from her hand, but from the station itself, as if the wood remembered the river that had once run close and wanted to move in rhythm with it. She set her feet in the pattern she had practiced until her body could do it with her eyes closed. She put her thumb on the knife's spine under her skirt. She breathed in. She let the breath go. The door waited. The men outside shuffled. The ridge held a shadow she trusted more than any paper in the county. She did not speak. She did not have to. The night spoke. It said, "Someone who knows your name from before will walk down into your circle now, and the old wrong will be measured with a new hand." The vultures circled lower, as if the air had told them that the story would move from patience to choice before the next hour turned. Kaya came down from the ridge, the way a hawk folds itself into air and lands without noise. She did not call out. She stepped from shadow to shadow until the station's wall took her in, and then she lifted her hand and tapped once on the plank, so a woman's ear inside would know whose knuckles made that small sound. Agnes loosened the latch with 2 fingers and let her in. The lamplight touched Kaya's cheek and lit the pale thread of the old scar that ran from her ear into her hairline. Her eyes went first to Etta's hands, and then to the floor, and the door, and the window, in one sweep that measured every edge in the room. She nodded to Agnes and Brother Matthew, and put her palm lightly on Jonah's shoulder, where he hid behind the stove. He flinched, then stilled when he saw who she was, and how quietly she moved. Kaya stood in front of Etta, and spoke low, with a voice that could be thrown as far as a knife when needed, but now fell soft as dust. "River stance," she said, and made a small circle with her left hand. Etta matched it with her own. The 2 circles met in the thick air and sat there, invisible and strong. Then Kaya's mouth curved in the side smile she had used to correct Etta years ago, when the knife still felt like a strange language in her hand. "You called," she said. "I heard." Etta did not speak. She touched her fingers together and shaped one small sign that Kaya had taught her for the hour when too much noise means death. Not yet. Kaya's eyes warmed for a breath and then cooled again as she drew the room into her bones. She walked to the window and pushed the cloth aside a finger's width and let the night draw a line across her pupil. Outside, Pike sat with his back to the fire and his face turned to the station door, like a man loving his own patience. Kincaid held his badge between 2 fingers and ran the chain across his lip, and then dropped it as if the metal had burned him. The 3rd man cut meat with a short knife and flicked bits to a dog, the way a man keeps his hand busy when his mind wants to jump. Kaya returned to Etta and set her palm on the widow's forearm. "I can take you out before the sun," she said, "through the old cut where the river ate stone and left a tunnel. You can be in the cottonwoods by morning. They will look for you where a horse can run. They will not look where a woman can crawl." She held Etta's gaze for a long beat, waiting for the kind of fear that makes legs choose distance over truth. Etta's head moved once. It meant no. She touched the hem of her skirt where the knife rode quiet, and then she looked at Pike's boots through the window cloth, as if sight could wear leather down to nothing, and then she put her hand over her own throat, not because the vow held her like a rope, but because she had decided to keep it even in a room with her teacher in it. Kaya's mouth tightened. She nodded. "Then we turn the river here," she said, "against their rock." Brother Matthew cleared his throat because a confession had pressed up behind it and would not be put off. He told Kaya what he had told Agnes and Etta about the parish book and the wrong hour and the smear of red wax. As he spoke, his eyes went to the shelf where the undertaker's ledger lay rolled and tied. "I can fix the page," he whispered. "I can cross a line and write another. But fixing a page is not the same as fixing a man." Kaya listened without blinking. Writers of books hold knives too, she said. Not unkind. Different shape. Same cut, if you are careless. Do not be careless with your book. Agnes reached to the shelf and took down a small packet wrapped in muslin and tied with blue string. She set it on the table. Inside lay a toe tag that had once hung from a foot, now dirt, marked Unknown Number 4 in a tidy hand that had not expected to be questioned. With it lay a scrap of wax with the bite of a signet ring pressed half into it, like a moon that had been pushed into mud and pulled back quick. Agnes did not look at Kincaid when she set the scrap down. She looked at the door. A man asked me to burn this last winter, she said. I said I do not burn paper for men. I burn the dead. Paper can hold its own flame if it needs to. Jonah stared at the toe tag like it might turn back into a foot and walk across the room to accuse him by name. He put both hands flat on the table and leaned in, the way a man does when the ocean begins to move under his boat and he cannot find the shore. I said a thing to Pike about the spring, he said to the table surface, to the toe tag, to his own swelling shame. I told him where the deed was kept and how Etta keeps to her vow. I told myself no harm would come if water went where cattle wanted it. I told myself a lie to let me sleep. Kaya put a hand over his, and he flinched again, because he had not expected mercy from the direction of the blade. Men lie so their sleep can keep on breathing, she said. Wake is better, harder, better. Outside, Kincaid called again. His voice had found a little courage, because he had found a script that told him a way through. I'll hear you in private, he said. My badge protects words said to me. He believed that even as he pretended not to see Pike's eyes on him. Come out, Miss Dunn, or your widow. Let us speak as neighbors. The word neighbors came out thin and sour. Agnes's face went flat. She lifted her ledger and ran her thumb along a page that had squares and names and sums, written in a black stride. A different column had read. She spoke toward the door, but not loud. If you set fire to my wall, she said, I will write your name in red, not for a bill, for the lot. She paused. My father taught me to line a page for years yet to come. I have space enough to carry you to your winter. Kaya watched Etta watching the floor. She angled her shoulder so the deputy could not see her from the ridge if the cloth shifted. Then she drew Etta's attention back to her with a tap and leaned in so her words could be small and sharp. Do you remember the willow switch? Do you remember why I cut you with it? Etta's mouth twitched, as if speech wanted to come, and she would not let it. She blinked. Kaya answered her own question. Because you were stone. Stone is heavy and hits hard one time, and then waits a long time, and does not learn. River is light and moves fast, and keeps its own mind, and arrives. Tonight, you are river. Etta moved her weight into her feet in the pattern Kaya had taught her. She drew the knife in her mind, but left it where it was on her body. Kaya's palm hovered over Etta's wrist, the way a teacher hovers a hand over a pupil's shoulder when the work is almost right and does not need a push, only the comfort of a warm truth nearby. Wind came down the draw with the smell of cattle and the taste of iron. Pike stood, sensing something in the ground and in his own chest, and in the way the dog lifted its head in a question that had teeth behind it. He pointed with his chin toward the ridge where Kaya had stood. The shadow was gone now. Men do not like losing a shadow they have counted. It makes them think about counting wrong. Kincaid's voice thinned further and then snapped, the way a string snaps when a boy keeps pulling for sound and gets silence as his prize. By order of the county, he said, as if he stood in a church carved from law and not in a wash where dust took more oaths than men ever did. I can put this station under guard. I can open your door and search your rooms and tally your goods until I am satisfied you hold nothing you should not. That is my right. Agnes set the ledger down and walked 3 quiet steps until she could lay her palm on the door. Open my door, and you will find a kettle, a ledger, a bone whistle, a woman who took a vow, another woman who does not break her students, a priest whose book will be corrected, and a fool who came to ask pardon before he hanged. Her hand slid down to the latch. She did not lift it. Count that, if you are hungry for numbers. Etta took a thin strip of window glass and wedged it under the sill so the pane would ring if a hand touched it. She sprinkled more flour along the baseboard where shadow would hide feet if feet came where they should not. She held the lamp up and cupped the chimney with her hand and then set it low so the light pooled and did not spill. She took the bone whistle from her tongue and set it on the table and wiped it dry and put it back under her tongue, not because she needed it now, but because its weight reminded her that a call had been sent and answered. That knowledge made her shoulders rest easier on her ribs. Kaya gestured toward the back door that opened on the small yard, where the mare's hoof had cut a half moon in the hard dirt. If they come at the front, she said, you will give ground 3 steps, and then turn past the stove and cut nothing. She touched Etta's sleeve. Do not cut, unless it ends a thing. Do not cut to teach. Men do not learn from that lesson. Brother Matthew's hands trembled around his hat brim. He looked like a boy who had been told to hold still during a storm. Is there a way without blood? He asked. Could we surrender the paper? The spring? Water belongs to God. He will not mind which hands carry it. Agnes did not soften it for him. God does not drink here, she said. Men do. They choke each other with cups and call it righteousness. Kaya pulled a small spool of horsehair line from her pocket and gave it to Etta. Trip it low, she said. A man's pride wears his eyes high. His feet are stupid. Use that. Etta smiled the smallest smile a mouth can make without opening. She tied the line 2 inches off the ground, across the path past the stove, and in the low light, it vanished. Outside, the third man rose and walked to the trough with the lazy carriage of trouble. He bent and splashed his face, and then flicked water toward the station door, as if baptizing the wood to mock the priest. The dog trotted after a cricket. Pike watched the ridge again, and did not like the way it held the last of its shadows. When the night sat at its heaviest, a small noise lifted from the far side of the wash. Hooves. Not close. Not yet, but many. Kincaid straightened. Hear that? He asked. Pike's head tilted, listening for the count inside the sound. Drive, he said. The word was not a question. He looked at the third man. Get the boys. Light 2 fires and put them where they'll look like brush glow. We'll walk the cattle toward the station and then turn them off. The wall will break. They'll run out or burn. The third man smiled in a way that let you see his teeth were not all his. That wall won't take a hard look from 20 head, much less 200. Kincaid swallowed. We don't need 200, just enough to make the house choose. Brother Matthew heard the hooves too. He stood and put his hand on the door, and then took it off like the wood had told him to keep himself to himself. Dear God, he said. Dear God. He did not ask for deliverance. He asked for strength, not to flinch. Kaya moved Etta with 2 fingers and a look. The river flowed around a new rock. The lamp went down to a breath. Agnes slid the ledger into a sack and tied it, and then set it back on the shelf, higher now, as if height could make it safer. She tucked the toe tag packet into her apron like a woman who carries a talisman, not because she thinks it magic, but because she knows men are made of paper as much as of blood in this county. Pike and his men lit brush piles at 2 points along the wash. Smoke rolled low and slow across the ground, and then lifted and spread like a skirt dragged by a woman crossing a floor to leave a room without comment. The cattle bunched at the smoke out of habit and fear, and then turned, and the men walked them with soft curses and sharper jabs of sticks until the herd felt the draw of movement and followed it. The sound grew into a thing with a chest. Dirt shook. Inside, the mare stamped once and then held still. Etta put her hand on the animal's neck and felt the tremor there and pressed back until the tremor thought twice about owning the moment. Kaya went to the back wall and put her hand on the boards and closed her eyes and counted the coming in a language that does not need numbers. Too many for the wall, she said, not soft and not loud. We turn the lead, or we pray it falls slow. Etta took the lamp and moved it where the crack under the door would throw a ribbon of light across the ground outside. She had watched cattle shy from a shine like that when the light hit a puddle after a rain. She set the lamp so the glass would flare and made a small pool where the first hooves would land. Agnes took the flower and dusted a white arc across the threshold to make a bright crescent that would take a beast's eye a half step to decipher. It was nothing. It was something. On the edge where panic rides, a speck turns a beast, if you put it right. Kincaid rode to the side and lifted his arm and brought it down. The herd moved as one tight muscle. Pike sat his horse dead center and grinned, because men grin at their own plans before the first consequence arrives. The dog barked, and then ran circles, and then shut up, because even a dog knows when the earth is busy. As the front animals reached the station's little yard, their noses found the sharp scent of lamp, oil, and hot glass, and the thin twist of flour. The first cow rolled her eye and stepped aside. The second followed without knowing why. A third put her hoof wrong on the trough edge, slipped, and swung her head, knocking her neighbor off balance so the line of bodies kinked. Something in the herd said, "Turn." Something else said, "Go." Those two commands met and fought, and sent a wave backward through the mass, the way a shiver runs through a human back when a thought comes that the body cannot accept. Pike saw the bend and snarled. "Push," he yelled. The third man cracked his stick across a heifer's hip. Kincaid yelled nothing. He pressed his hat down as if it would hold his skull on when the noise hit it. Kaya picked up the lamp and dropped it an inch and lifted it and dropped it again, slowly, so the light would flutter like water. She stood where a beast's eye would catch her shape as something not quite solid. To cattle, a ghost is as good a wall as any, if it flickers right. Etta went left one step, put her hand on the mare again, and breathed with the animal until both their chests found a single countryed rhythm. Agnes held the ledger sack to her against her ribs and whispered a number only she knew. The herd hit the yard and then split, the way a river splits around a rock that knows its own heft. But there were too many, and the wall was too close, and the trough made a hard edge that did not forgive clumsy feet. One steer went down on his knees and bellowed and scrambled and pushed another into the garden fence, so that pickets snapped and jumped like dry bones. Hooves thudded against the station boards. Dust rose inside the room through the old cracks, as if the land were coming in to sit with them, whether they had asked it to or not. Brother Matthew went to his knees without choosing it. He held his hat. He whispered the word mercy without putting God's name to it, because he felt, for the first time in months, that God might be watching from too far a ridge to hear a man's small voice. Jonah pressed himself deeper into his corner and bit his knuckle and tasted blood, and thought maybe he would not mind if the rope came for him, if the station lived, because a man can carry his own end. If he sees a beginning, he helped protect. Kincaid's horse shied hard, and the deputy slid sideways and clung like a bad memory to a man who wants to forget. Pike wheeled his mount against the push and slapped its rump and swore a thin oath that made his lips look mean, even in the smoke. The third man disappeared for a heartbeat between two bodies, and then came up cussing, with a broken stick and a face full of dust. The wall groaned. A beam cracked with a sound like a snapped neck. The lamp in Kaya's hand flared and went low again. Flour floated in the air like snow falling up. Etta could feel the knife at her spine like a cool confession, waiting to be spoken, and not yet needing to be said. She squeezed the mare's neck, and the mare blew and stood, because good mares know when steadiness is the only gift they can give, and give it. On the far side of the herd, a dark horse broke free and ran across the line of movement with its rider, low and balanced, cutting the flow not with muscle, but with angle. For a second, Pike thought it was one of his own hands. Then he saw hair that was not his men's, and he swore again, louder, because the body on that horse knew cattle the way a river knows banks. Kaya rode into the pressure and made a shape with her horse that took the lead cow's eye and turned it without touch. Two more followed. The kink in the herd straightened, then bent the other way. The mass of bodies shifted, and the station's wall breathed once like a lung after a long hold. Pike shouted and kicked. "That woman!" he spat. "Shoot that witch!" Kincaid lifted his gun and then dropped it an inch, because shooting into cattle at a run is the same as pushing your hand into a beehive and asking for sweetness. The third man fired anyway, wild, and a steer bawled and went down, and the herd stuttered, and then panic took them where reason had no seat. Agnes wrapped her arms around the ledger sack and closed her eyes, because sometimes not seeing is the only way to hear the truth coming. Brother Matthew opened his mouth and sang one straight line without words, the way a man sings to keep his throat from closing on his own fear. Jonah bent his head and put his forehead to the floor so the boards could tell him if they would hold. Kaya dragged the lead with a hard sweep of her leg and a hiss and a sway of her horse that made the world tilt for the cows nearest her. Etta stepped to the door and pressed her palm flat to the wood and pushed back as if a human hand could hold off a river. For a heartbeat, it did. Kincaid pulled at his reins and yelled at a boy 40 yards down who did not exist. Pike stood in his stirrups and brought his arm up to throw another signal. The dog fled under the wagon and hid with his tail, tucked so tight it might never come out again. The brush fires coughed and spat and then climbed, throwing new shadows onto old fear. The herd found a new path, the one Kaya offered them, away from the station's wall and along the trough, and past the broken pickets toward the open wash beyond. For 20 seconds that tasted like iron, the station lived. Then a bull that had not seen the lamp's ribbon until it painted his eyeball with shine came up hard and sideways and struck the corner with his shoulder. Wood screamed. The whole wall shook. A split ran down a post in a line so clean it looked like a pen had written it. Dust fell from the rafters like flour thrown by an angry hand. Pike grinned again, because men grin when they see a plan and a bruise, both to claim. He looked at Kincaid, and then at the door, and then at the roof, as if he already saw it open to the stars. He lifted his arm to call for another push, a last shove, to finish what fear had begun. The ground answered first. The hooves rolled into a thunder that filled the wash from side to side, and the station's little yard became a throat the herd meant to run through until it had no breath left. Etta felt the floor quiver like a thing that wanted to lift and float. Kaya's horse slid and caught itself and slid again. Agnes clutched the ledger so hard the string cut her palm and left a clean line that would dry into a scar she would trace in old age when numbers failed her eyes. Brother Matthew's song turned to a sound that was not singing and not prayer and not human in the simple way of words anymore. The cattle came on, a low living wall that did not know itself as anything but need. The station leaned. The beam groaned. The latch rattled on its leather. Flour leapt in the air and made the room a snow globe shaken by a careless hand. The door breathed in, breathed out, and then the next breath would tell whether wood remembers how to hold or whether it learns how to break. The door took the next breath and held. The beam above it gave a slow complaint that sounded like old men in a church pew standing to leave. The bull backed off 3 steps, shook his head, and turned with the rest as Kaya's horse crossed his eye again and made a path that felt more like safety than collision. The herd poured past the trough and the split pickets and into the open wash. Dust fell inside the station, soft like a sigh after a hard decision. Etta stood with her palm on the door and felt the wood grow quiet under her hand. She took her fingers away and looked at them as if the grains of flour on her skin could tell her what to do next. They could not. The next thing to do came from outside. Pike rode at the flank and swung down before his horse had fully stopped. He stalked across the yard with his head low and his hands open in the way of men who think they have been mocked. Kincaid came 3 steps behind, his gun half up and then half down again, as if the barrel were a scale and the air did not know what to weigh. The third man dragged a length of rope with a hard loop in it, and he smiled like a stagehand bringing on a prop he had always wanted to use. Agnes put the ledger sack down on the highest shelf and stepped away, so it would not look like she had put a crown on something and dared anyone to try to take it. Brother Matthew stood, wiped his hands on his coat without knowing it, and made his face still. Jonah pressed his back against the wall and closed his eyes, just for one breath, because he did not want the next thing he saw to be himself. Pike stopped at the threshold and tapped the posted notice with 2 fingers. The paper rattled under the touch as if it wanted to climb down and run. "Enough games," he said. "Give me the deed, or give me your brother-in-law. I'll trade a paper for a neck." Agnes reached toward the latch and stopped before she touched it. "There are ways to ask," she said. Pike put his boot forward and ground the toe into the threshold again. He liked the mark he was making, a crescent that said, "This place remembers me, whether it wants to or not." "Kincaid," he said without looking back. "Read your law for them. The part about harboring a suspect." Kincaid read the words from memory because he had practiced them under his breath in case he ever got the chance to be the kind of man who stands all the way up. "Any person giving aid or shelter to a suspect named in a county warrant shall themselves be subject to—" Agnes cut him off, not with words, but by looking at him as a woman looks at a rooster who has wandered into her kitchen and thinks he invented dawn. He faltered and lost the rest of the sentence out the side of his mouth. The third man flipped the rope to test its weight and flung the loop up and over the lowest branch of the cedar that leaned into the yard. The rope hissed through bark and settled. He tied a quick knot one-handed, the way a man ties who has practiced on more stubborn things than cedar. He worked with the easy pride of someone who thinks skill makes him righteous. Jonah stepped forward before the rope finished settling. He put his hands out like a man stepping into cold water. "Me," he said, and the word was a dry stick breaking. "He wants me, or paper. Give him me." He did not look at Etta, because he could not afford the sight of the fact he had made a choice worth making. Agnes reached without looking and touched Jonah's sleeve to hold him in place. "Wait," she said. The word landed on the air with a weight that came from numbers and names and holes and boards she had hammered back into place, with a sorrow most men never get to count right. "Bring him," Pike told the third man, and the man grinned like he had just been given a sweet. He stepped past the door, and Etta stepped with him, not big, not loud, not brave in any simple sense, but in the way a river is brave, by being exactly what it is, where it is most needed. He reached his hand toward Jonah. Etta moved her own hand in a line that was not a line until it was. The knife came up around the man's wrist, the way water draws a curve around a rock and leaves the stone surprised to find itself wet. The blade kissed skin just enough to teach. The man stopped because the body has its own books, and one of them says, "A bright touch at that certain tendon means move slow and think fast, or lose something you like keeping." Etta backed him one step, with the knife's breath near his vein, and then slid past him, as smooth as spilled oil. She put her back to the doorpost where the light was worst for eyes that have not practiced at being blind. She raised her left hand, empty, palm open to show Pike the shape of nothing. She lowered her right, the knife flat along her forearm, where it could be a piece of her, and not a separate idea. Her eyes cut to Kincaid, and held there, not beseeching, not shaming, just holding him on the page, like a thumb on a line that should not be lost. Kincaid saw the toe of Pike's boot. He saw the scar on it, and knew, with a slow, sick bloom in his chest, exactly what boot it was. He had been near enough to the grave to see Etta touch that scar with her thumb one last time, before the dirt fell back. He had told himself since January that cowhide was cowhide, and men bury boots all the time, and memory is not proof. But now, the scar sat on a foot that had laughed while the wall shuddered. He felt his badge chain under his fingers and could not tell if it was hot, or if his skin had simply decided to admit something at last. His eyes went to Pike's hand. He saw the ring. He had seen the impression of that ring in wax at the coroner's office. A half-bite on a corner of a form that had been signed at a wrong hour with a wrong witness. The ash in his mouth tasted like his own words. "Sheriff's coming," the third man said lightly, trying to prick Pike where pride lives, to see if pride would bleed. He was guessing, but his guess landed the way a pebble lands ahead of a rolling wagon. It made wheels jump. The hooves came before the sentence could end. One horse, then another, then the quiet, steady drumming of an old mount carrying a man who rides to a thing, because if he does not ride to it, He will dream it wrong and wake up tired for a week. Sheriff Rowan Bly walked his horse through the tail of the dust the herd had left and brought it down in the yard in a way that made the horse look like it had been born there. He had the face of a man who had thrown other men out of his kitchen by the collar and then gone back to stirring beans while they picked gravel from their teeth. He took in the rope over the branch and the notice on the door and the set of Etta's shoulders and the shape of Kincaid's shame without changing the slow weather of his eyes. "Evening," he said, as if he had come for coffee. "What's all this 3 extra hands doing in Miss Dunn's yard after sundown? I count a rope. I count a warrant. I count a lot of smoke I didn't order." He swung down and let the reins hang. His horse put its head low like a man who pushes his hat back to see better. Pike smiled with his lips and not his teeth. "Sheriff," he said, "we're preserving order. We had a stampede. We turned it. We came to ask for a paper that rightfully belongs to our concern. And there's a suspect inside, your deputy." And here he tilted his chin toward Kincaid, like a man showing off a dog he had trained to say grace. "Has already posted the county's will." Bly's eyes went to the notice. He read it. His mouth chewed once on nothing. He looked back at Kincaid with an expression that did not move the skin at all, because it was too old and too patient for drama. "You post this because you believe it, Bram, or because your hand forgot who it belongs to?" Kincaid's throat worked. He looked at the ring on Pike's finger, and at the toe of the boot, and at the scrap of wax Agnes had set on the table, and then carried now in her apron like a hot coal she would not drop. He could not get his voice to go around his teeth. Bly held out his hand. Agnes stepped forward and put the packet into it. He opened it. He looked at unknown number 4 and at the half-bite the signet had put in the wax. He turned the wax toward Pike's ring. He did not make a show of it. He just let his eyes do the quiet math an honest man does when he wakes up with a wrong number and is tired of pretending. It adds. "What did the coroner's paper say?" he asked, without looking away from the ring. Brother Matthew found his voice because a man with a book and a conscience sometimes needs another man's bluntness to let him speak. "Right hand thrust," he said. "The report lists a right hand. Mrs. Vale is left-handed." "And who told you to write the burial that night?" Bly asked, turning his eyes to the priest now. "In the margin, with the wax smear." "Mr. Pike," Brother Matthew said, the name coming out like a pebble falling from his mouth, because it had sat there for months and made a sore place. "He said the county needed the order. He said you wanted it written. He said—" He stopped because he had run out of ways to be excused. Bly folded the packet shut and handed it back to Agnes. "I do want order," he said. "I want it enough to break a finger over it if I have to." He turned to Kincaid. "You put your name to Dr. Callow's inquest? Did you stand there and tell him which hand wrote a cut? Or did you just nod until your neck learned the movement like a habit?" Kincaid's voice came back small and treacherous. "I signed what was put under my eyes." "And by whom?" Bly asked. Kincaid looked at Pike. The ring on Pike's finger took the last of the light and kept it. "By a man with a signet," he said. "I thought it was county business." That's what he said. He said if we kept the paper neat, the town would be calmer. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "I thought calming folks was half my job." Bly stepped close to Kincaid and took the badge chain in his fingers and lifted it an inch. "Your job is to put this heavy where it belongs," he said, letting the chain drop so it slapped Kincaid's shirt, "not to hang it where another man points." He reached to Kincaid's belt and took his gun in one smooth motion and handed it butt first to Agnes. "Hold that," he said. "Please." Pike laughed, a short slice of sound. "You can play sanctified all you like," he said, slipping his ringed hand into his coat. "But the spring is ours by need, and the rope is ours by right. I'll take one or the other before moonrise." He jerked his head at the third man, and the man moved, quick and low, like he did not care which target his hands would choose, as long as his hands did something. Etta did not wait for him to choose. She stepped into him as he came and gave ground with him, 2 inches, then another, and then she turned, just enough, so that his feet crossed a hair's width of horsehair line, 2 inches off the floor. It was not much. It was enough. His toe caught. His knee dropped. His hand came down, where her hand already waited. The knife she never raised somehow spoke exactly where it needed to. There was no blood on the blade when she finished, because she had cut muscle in a way that commanded stillness, more surely than a shout. The man froze, and then sat, looking more surprised than hurt. His hand forgot the rope. Pike pulled his gun. Agnes's ledger arm moved without thinking. She slid the ledger off the shelf and into the path of the barrel, the way a mother moves her body in front of a child. The book took the sight like it had been waiting its whole life to be useful in just that stupid way. The barrel hit leather and skittered an inch. Etta's boot came up and touched the gun hand with a dull sharpness that made fingers open. The gun fell. Bly's foot came down on it like a door closing. Kincaid watched his own breath go out and then come back with a groan. Pike went for his knife, because men who love tools love too. Etta let him. She stepped back. She showed him the empty hand again. She let him see the other hand begin to move, and then not move. She let his eyes learn a lesson, and then doubt it. She turned her wrist and showed him the thing Kaya had wanted her to understand years ago, with a willow switch and a patient anger, that a blade is not a thing you swing. It is a conversation where you make the other hand say what you want, and then sign their name to it. They circled once in a space the size of a kitchen rug. Pike's grin came back, because he thought he had found a dance he knew. Etta's mouth stayed closed. She watched his shoulder, not his knife. She watched his heel. When his right shoulder dipped, the way it had to if the wound that killed her husband had been thrown from that angle, she moved left and stepped through the space. His pride made. The knife in her hand did not stab. It traced. It spoke to the hand that held his knife and told it to forget its strength. His knife fell before either of them quite understood that the moment of manhood he cherished had just been taken apart by a woman who refused to make any single flourish for a crowd that did not deserve one. Kaya's cough, soft and shaped like a bird's single call, came from the shadow by the stove. It was not a warning. It was an answer. Etta took one more step, turned Pike's wrist, let him feel the river in her bones, and ended the conversation. He went to his knees, then to his back, hard enough to make dust jump from the floor into a small cloud that looked like a soul changing its mind. His ring clicked against the board. His boots pushed. Etta pinned one with her heel and bent. She did not hurt him more than necessity demanded. She took the ring and slipped it off. She took the boots and stripped them with a practiced calm that made the room's eyes sting. "Enough," Bly said, and his voice filled the yard, to the eaves and the cedar branch, and the rope loop, and the posted paper, and the dog under the wagon, and the dark behind the stove, and every object in that space accepted the word as law, because it had been spoken by a man who did not use law to cover fear. He put cuffs on Kincaid with a careful hand that said the deputy would be walking, not dragged. He cuffed Pike with a hand that said dragging was always an option, but not the one chosen today. He nodded to the third man where he sat on the floor, trying to remember how fingers work. "You'll come too," he said. "You can keep your hands, if you keep them still." Brother Matthew leaned his head against the door frame and let a thin laugh out that did not sound like joy, but did not sound like despair either. It sounded like a box lid lifting and letting a little light land on a secret. "Dear God," he said, and this time the name was not a wish for distance, but a note of thanks for nearness. Agnes unrolled the ledger with both hands. The leather was scuffed where the gun had bit it and left a small half moon. She took up her pen. She wrote 6 names where unknowns had sat all winter, as if those lines had been waiting for her on purpose. She wrote slowly, like a woman stitching a wound. She put a dot where a dot belonged and let the ink sit and sink. She did not look up when Kincaid swallowed a sound and when Pike stared at the ceiling, as if the boards would teach him how to live inside a room where he did not get to decide where the air went. Jonah came out from behind the stove and stood with his head down, his hands open, like a man at an altar when the priest says it is time. "Hang me anyway," he said, half to Bly and half to Etta. "I sold a thing that wasn't mine. If a rope teaches the county not to listen to men like me, I'll take it. Bly looked at the rope. He looked at Jonah's face. He looked at Etta's hand on the knife that did not need to be used anymore. No, he said, simple. You don't get the rope. You get your work. That's harder, and it lasts longer. He turned to Etta. What about the spring? Etta glanced at Agnes, and then at the ledger, and then at the bone whistle glinting with a smudge of lamplight on the table. She put the knife down with deliberate gentleness and moved to the shelf where the deed sat, folded between a wagon inventory and an old letter with wash-stained edges. She took the deed and put it in Agnes's hands. She closed Agnes's fingers over it and held them there for 2 breaths. Agnes's mouth trembled. She opened it and shut it, and then nodded, because saying thank you would not hold this kind of gift in place. Holding the paper right would. Brother Matthew wiped his eyes with the heel of his hand and took his little parish book from his coat. He opened it and found the line with the wrong hour and the smear of wax. He crossed the line once, neat, and then wrote Mr. Vale's name in the proper place, with the proper day and the proper hour, and he signed it with his proper shame. Then he pressed his pen tip into the paper and made a tiny hole where the wrong name had lived, not to ruin the book, but to make a memory that would stick under his finger each time he turned the page and remind him what a page is for. Bly cut the rope from the cedar and coiled it. He held the coil like a question. Maybe I'll hang this over my desk, he said, so I can remember what it weighs when it lies. Maybe I'll scratch a line in my deposition today. Not a lie. A scratched line that leaves a space. The space will be the truth. The man whose name should be there will know it. He'll feel it every time he tries to sleep. He turned and walked his prisoners out. The third man limped. Kincaid looked like he had been borrowed from a softer world and returned scuffed. Pike looked naked without his boots, his stocking feet pale and mean in the dust. They went into the yard and into the wash and into a night that had space for men to learn without fire taking the lesson away. Bly did not look back because looking back is a small vanity, and he had given up small vanities when he chose to let his badge pull his spine straight. Kaya stood in the doorway beside Etta and watched nothing and everything. She put her palm to Etta's shoulder and left it there until the room's pulse slowed down. Then she took it away. You can come with me before dawn, she said again, not because Etta needed the escape now, but because naming the door is sometimes enough to make staying in the room a choice instead of a trap. Etta shook her head. She picked up the boots and the ring and carried them to the trough. She washed dust from the leather and from the metal and held them up. Water ran down her wrists. She set the ring in Agnes's palm. Agnes put it into the ledger's fold between 2 blank pages, like a pressed flower, to mark the place where sums shifted. Etta placed the boots on the trough's edge and let them drip, then laid them side by side. For one heartbeat, it looked like 2 feet were drying there after a long walk. Then the image broke into its true pieces. She stood and looked at the sky. Clouds that had dragged their knuckles along the distant buttes all day finally wrung themselves. Rain came in a thin curtain. It hit dust and turned to smell. It hit the cedar and turned to a whisper that said, the tree remembered 100 small storms and would take one more gladly. It hit Etta's face and did not wipe anything away because nothing on her face asked to be wiped. She let it be. Agnes unrolled a fresh sheet and wrote, paid in full, for a bill that had no coin attached. She dated it. She signed it. She slid the toe tag back into the packet and tied the blue string and put it away on a different shelf than before. Brother Matthew closed his book and held it to his chest and set his other hand flat on the ledger without asking, and Agnes let him, which was a forgiveness she could afford now that numbers felt like friends again. Kaya took the bone whistle and pressed it into Etta's hand. Keep it, she said, not to call me, to remind you that the river lives in your chest even when you forget where banks are. Etta closed her fingers. She lifted her head. She drew one breath the way you draw a line when you finally know what you want that line to mean, and then she let it go. When morning thinned the night into a light, you could walk through without asking permission. The yard looked smaller than it had under fear. The broken pickets stood like grave markers for a fight that had not claimed a life inside these walls. The trough shone. The boots sat there clean and dumb and heavy, with the weight of a story they no longer got to tell. The rope leaned in a coil, where Bly had left it on his saddle, as if even rope knows when it has been seen correctly and would like a quiet day. Kincaid's badge hung from a nail in the sheriff's office by noon. The chain looped twice, so it would not swing and catch the light and make the room look like it had a heartbeat it couldn't own. Bly wrote his deposition with a blunt pencil and a slow hand. He paused once, and then scratched out a single line, carefully, with the small knife he used to sharpen the pencil, and left a narrow white absence where a name would sit if a certain man learned to deserve the weight of letters. He folded the paper and sealed it with wax and pressed no ring into it at all. He left it plain. He wanted it to stand on its own legs. Dr. Callow reopened his inquest file and added a note in a thin, affronted hand that admitted a mistake and did not enjoy doing so. He wrote, "Right hand thrust presumed in error," and underlined "presumed" once, with a line that shook because his lunch had been too strong, or because a man thinks about his own hands when he has to correct one. Agnes posted a fresh handbill at the station door that said the kitchen would open earlier on Sundays, and that coffee would be 2 cents to drovers who minded their animals. She left the scuff in the threshold where Pike had ground his toe, not because she liked it, but because memory needs a few honest marks to keep it from turning into a liar. She cleaned the place where the gun had kissed the ledger and left the half-moon there, too. She touched the scar the string had cut into her palm and decided it could stay. Brother Matthew walked to the small graveyard with his book and read a single line over the plot he had misnamed last winter, then spoke the right name in a voice he had shined with care overnight. He took off his hat because a man should have to feel the sky on his hair when he says he is sorry to someone who cannot answer him back. He left the plot with less weight in his spine. Jonah mended the fence. He worked like the boards were heavy and could learn to be light if he remembered to be gentle. He did not ask for mercy from anyone at the station because mercy arrives on its own terms, if it arrives at all. He slept in the stable that night and woke at every creak sigh because a man who has seen his own rope in a tree hears rope in the softest sounds for a while. Kaya left before dawn, as she said she would. She touched the mare's nose and the girl's shoulder. Etta would always be the girl with stubborn wrists in some part of Kaya's memory, and she walked out across the wash with a stride that belonged to the long old places of the world. She did not look back. Looking back, for her, belonged to days when the river was frozen and would not talk. Etta kept her vow. She spoke no more words that day. She did not need them. Her hands adjusted the latch. Her feet learned the new hollow in the threshold and stepped around it. Without thinking, she poured coffee. She hung the kettle over a flame that knew its work. She set a clean cup where a man like Bly would want it, and a plain plate where a man like Kincaid would sit if he ever learned to come with his head bowed and his hands open. She put a polished pebble from the wash into the drawer with the bone whistle. Next to the deed she no longer kept for herself. She touched each object once and closed the drawer gently. Rain came again, in a quick veil, and then left, and the dust drank it without thanks. The vultures took their high circles back up into the blue and forgot the exact shape the yard had been at midnight. The basin wore the day like a woman who has learned to let heat be heat and shadow be shadow without asking the air to be kind. The station stood. It had been made to stand. It would take more storms and more hooves and more hands. It would hold names in a ledger and smell of coffee and horses and pencil lead and oil and the faint sweet of flour, long after the last man who had tried to use paper to cover his fear forgot where he put his ring. In the undertaker's ledger, the 6 red lines became names that sat their full height in black. In the parish book, a midnight burial moved to noon where it belonged. In the sheriff's deposition, a single line was carved into absence with a neat blade. That absence speaks louder than any letter if you know how to read. If you open the books in the right order, you will feel where the truth went around the rock and wrote its own path on the page. What moment sealed Edda's legend for you? I'm reading every comment. Subscribe for more Dust Cinematic Frontier stories.